For 4 seasons, When Killers Get Caught has been obsessed with a single moment, the precise turning point where evil runs out of the room. We followed the clues, right? The mistakes, the investigations that finally brought some of the world's worst and most dangerous killers to justice. But justice doesn't end with the arrest. This season, we're going to tell a different kind of story. Instead of focusing on the killers, we're focusing on the people who survived them. Across the next 20 episodes, you'll hear the stories of men and women who refused to become another statistic. People who fought back, escaped the unimaginable, and rebuilt their lives after staring evil directly in the face. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't catching a killer, it's surviving one. Tonight's story begins long before anyone knew there was a serial killer hunting the streets of Tampa. It begins with a 17-year-old girl riding her bicycle home from work. It's November 3rd, 1984, in Tampa, Florida, shortly after 2 a.m. 17-year-old Lisa McVey is pedaling her bicycle home after finishing a late shift at the neighborhood donut shop. She's tired, and in only a few hours, she'll have to get up and do this all over again. To anyone passing by on the road, she's just another teenager riding in the dark. What they can't see is that Lisa has spent most of her life surviving things that no child ever should. She's learned how to stay calm and quiet when she's afraid, how to read people, how to stay alive. Those lessons have come at a devastating cost. Tonight, they'll become the reason that she survives. Because somewhere in the darkness, a predator is waiting, and within minutes, Lisa McVey finds herself in the hands of one of Florida's most prolific serial killers. And before the night is over, she'll begin a fight for survival that will help stop him forever. Now, when we talk about people who survive extraordinary crimes, sometimes we accidentally begin the story with the person who hurt them. We start with the date of the attack, the location, the last place they were seen, the moment this predator entered their life, and suddenly everything that happened before is just background. Bobby Joe Long did not meet Lisa McVey at the beginning of her story. He met her 17 years into it. And if we're going to understand the decisions that Lisa made during those 26 hours Bobby kidnapped her, I think we first have to understand who was this 17-year-old girl who got on her bicycle that night. Because Lisa McVey had spent most of her childhood looking for somewhere, anywhere that she could really feel safe. So Lisa grew up in Tampa, Florida, but stability was difficult to find. Her mother, Catherine McVey, struggled with addiction, and during parts of her childhood, she was in and out of the foster care system. Eventually, when Lisa was 14 years old, her mother sent her to live with her grandmother, Diane McVey. And the arrangement was supposed to give Lisa some stability while also helping her care for her grandmother. On paper, this sounded like a solution. Lisa could live with family, she'd have a permanent home, and she wouldn't have to keep moving around based on her mother's issues with addiction. Except Diane's house wasn't safe either. See, Lisa's grandmother lived with a boyfriend, Morris Elwood, and according to Lisa, he started sexually abusing her almost as soon as she moved into the home. This abuse became Lisa's life from the next 3 years. From 14 to 17, Morris Elwood molested her on an almost nightly basis, and he would bring his gun into her bedroom, hold it to her head while he was assaulting her, and the implication was right there. If you fight back, I'll kill you. Diane McVey was not in any way a victim here. She was completely complicit in the abuse. She not only failed to protect Lisa, she was sometimes present when it was happening. Or she would pretend it didn't happen while she was one room over. Both Morris and Diane also physically beat Lisa for minor indiscretions. Child abuse is one of the most unforgivable crimes because you aren't just hurting a child in the moment. You're teaching them something about the world before they're old enough to understand that the lesson is wrong. Children are supposed to believe that adults will protect them, that their home is safe, that love doesn't hurt, that when someone says, "You can trust me," those words actually have meaning. Abuse takes all of that away. See, it teaches a child to question kindness, to look for danger in people who claim they love them, to understand far too young that sometimes the person who is supposed to protect you is the real person you need protection from. And once a child learns this lesson, you can't simply ask them to forget it now that they've grown up. That's what makes child abuse so devastating. The abuse might happen in childhood, but the betrayal can fundamentally change the way a person understands trust, safety, love, and even themselves long after their childhood is over. Lisa started looking for safety outside of her home. And thankfully for Lisa, she had some good people outside of her home. She found that safety through her job at Krispy Kreme Donuts in Tampa. And years later, when Lisa talked about that job, she never described it like most teenagers might talk about responsibility. She called it her safe haven. That detail has always stuck with me. Think about how bad things have to be at home for a teenager to look at a late night shift at a donut shop and think, this is where I feel safe. At Krispy Kreme, Lisa had people around her, friends and coworkers. She had responsibilities that gave her a sense of accomplishment, and she had a manager who she was very close to, and she described him as a father figure in her life. With this job, she could work, she could earn her own money, and every single hour she spent there was an hour she wasn't in the home with Morris Elwood. So Lisa worked late. She picked up extra shifts whenever they were available, and she started trying to imagine a future where she could finally leave and be free. But by the fall of 1984, even that future was becoming harder for her to see. Diane had actually moved out of the home at this point, leaving the 17-year-old Lisa living with her abuser. Lisa was still going to work, though, riding that bicycle back and forth, still functioning from the outside. But internally, Lisa was reaching the end of what she believed that she could endure. She was starting to feel hopeless, and on November 2nd, 1984, Lisa wrote a suicide note. She didn't think she could live any more days in the house with Morris Elwood, and she knew she wasn't legally allowed to move out yet. So she wrote the note, and then she pedaled to her last shift at Krispy Kreme. She wasn't going to leave her friends and coworkers short-staffed. And that night, the shift stretched early into the morning hours of November 3rd. When she finally finished working, sometime around 2 in the morning, she got on her bicycle and began riding home. She didn't have a car because she was saving her money to move. So this bicycle was her only opportunity for freedom. And before we introduce Bobby Joe Long, I want you to picture Lisa exactly as she was in that moment. 17 years old, pedaling through Tampa in the middle of the night after working a late shift. Not famous yet, not the girl who survived. She wasn't the woman who would eventually become a law enforcement officer and spend decades helping other survivors and telling them their lives could continue after they experienced horrible things. She was just Lisa, a teenager shuffled between homes, a teenager who had learned firsthand adults could not be trusted, a teenager who found more peace at work than she did at home, and a teenager who was carrying an amount of pain that no one around her could see. That is the Lisa McVey that Bobby Joe Long encountered on that dark road. And I want to be careful here because sometimes when people discuss Lisa McVey, they discuss her childhood as if that abuse prepared her for what happened next. It didn't. There is no upside to a child being abused. There's no lesson she needed to learn that she couldn't have learned somewhere safely. What happened to Lisa never should have happened. Period. But by 17, she did understand that dangerous people move in certain ways. She knew that sometimes people don't say what they mean. She knew that anger escalates quickly, and she knew how to listen even while she was afraid. She knew how to watch people's behavior. And she'd already learned that sometimes surviving a frightening person means controlling your own reaction long enough to figure out what they want. Those skills weren't gifts. They were things Lisa had been forced to develop because so many adults in her life had failed her. And in a few minutes, they were going to matter enormously. Lisa wasn't the only person moving through Tampa in those early mornings. There was a man driving through the city looking for someone vulnerable, and his name was Bobby Joe Long. For months, women around Tampa had been disappearing, turning up murdered. Police were searching for the person responsible, but they didn't even know who they were looking for. Lisa wasn't even aware, really, of the case happening around her. She didn't know there was a serial killer hunting women in her town. She didn't know that the man who was about to approach her had done this 8 times before. She was simply trying to get home. And from Bobby Jong Long's perspective, Lisa looked like an easy target. A thin teenage girl alone in the middle of the night on nothing but a bicycle. But he couldn't really see who Lisa was. He couldn't have known how she would handle fear. He couldn't have known that she had learned to pay attention to men like him. And he definitely couldn't know about the decision Lisa had been contemplating only hours earlier. This is the part of Lisa's story that always hits my heart. Before Bobby Joe Long found her, she had been contemplating taking her own life. And then when someone else decided that Lisa's life was his to take, her response was no. If she was going to die, she was not going to let a man decide. To understand the danger that Lisa stepped into at 2 a.m. on November 3rd, let's briefly discuss the man in the red Dodge Magnum. His name was Bobby Joe Long. He was 31 years old. He worked as an x-ray technician, and he lived in a modest apartment in Tampa. To the outside world, he appeared quiet, ordinary, and frankly unremarkable. Before 1984, Long had already built a trail of violence. In the late 70s and 80s, he gained the law enforcement moniker, the classified ad rapist. He answered local newspaper ads for items for sale, targeting, assaulting, and robbing women in their homes in South Florida. So by 1984, this was just an escalation from sexual assault to serial murder. Between March and November of 1984, just 8 months, Bobby Joe Long systematically hunted women across the Tampa Bay region. He targeted women he thought were vulnerable, isolated at night, or women who worked along the Tampa red light district. He was an opportunistic predator who relied on speed, deception, and brute force. By the time that car pulled up alongside Lisa McVey's bicycle, he had already victimized at least 50 women in sexual assaults and had moved on to murdering 8 women. Those women were Artis Ann Wick, Lana Long, Michelle Sims, Elizabeth Lautenbach, Chanel Williams, Karen Dinsfriend, Kimberly Hops, and Victoria Elliott. These women aged 18 to 28. And a note, Long would actually commit 2 more murders after releasing Lisa before police caught him, bringing his total known murder count to 10. In November of 1984, the Tampa Police Department and local sheriff's office were locked in a pretty desperate search. They were aware they were looking for a serial killer. Bodies were being discovered bound and dumped in rural areas in Hillsborough County. They knew that this was a single person because forensically, they were finding consistent clues, DNA that was the same across multiple crime scenes. But beyond that evidence, law enforcement really had no name, no vehicle description, no suspect profile, and no living witnesses who had survived an abduction. He was operating with total impunity, complete anonymity. And Bobby Joe Long believed he was invisible, invincible, and entirely in control of everything. That is, until he decided to kidnap Lisa McVey. In that moment, Lisa was 17, exhausted, pedaling that red speed as fast as she could through the damp night air. The streets were mostly dark and empty. And usually, when she would take her bike and ride home, that was the time that she had to process her thoughts, even the darkest ones. So she wasn't really paying attention when she turned off of Hillsborough Avenue onto a much quieter, dimly lit stretch of road. And so she didn't hear the car engine coast up behind her until it was too late. In a fraction of a second, Bobby Joe Long pulled the Dodge Magnum beside her, threw open the door, and attacked. He ripped Lisa off of her bicycle with such sudden force that there was nothing she could do. Before she could even process what was going on, he already had a blindfold over her eyes. He pressed a cold steel gun against her temple, told her to be quiet, and shoved her down onto the floorboards of the car. In situations like this, the human brain typically hits one of 3 primal switches: fight, flight, or freeze. Most people thrown into total darkness with a gun against their head would enter a state of shock. Lisa did feel that terror spike. She knew with absolute clarity that she was in extreme, life-threatening danger. But Lisa didn't freeze. Instead, a switch flipped deep inside of her mind. She was terrified, make no mistake, but fear was not unfamiliar for her. She'd spent years being afraid. It still allowed her to watch, listen, notice small changes, and figure out what might happen next. And now, unable to see where this stranger was taking her, she fell back on the only thing that she could do. She paid attention. And that's the moment that sets Lisa McVey apart in the entire history of criminal survival. She stopped thinking like a victim and she started thinking like she was a witness who was going to live through this nightmare. She couldn't see, but she had four other senses, and she resolved to use every single one of them. She told herself if she was going to die, she was going to leave enough clues behind to catch the man who killed her. And if she lived, she would be the one who put him away. While Bobby Joe Long drove, believing he had total control over a supposedly helpless victim, Lisa was cataloging every detail she could. She measured time and movement, counting the seconds between his turns. She paid attention to whether the car stopped at red lights or stop signs, noting the acceleration, the vibration of the energy, the vibration of the engine, and the rough feeling of the carpet under her face. She started mapping the terrain. She listened to the sound of the car tires on the ground, and she was aware when it switched from smooth asphalt to loose gravel. That meant they were leaving main roads. She listened to the environment. She picked up on the ambient sounds outside of the car. There was the faint sound of passing traffic, distant highway noise, but specifically, planes taking off and landing in the distance. She used her sense of smell. She noted it smelled like stale cigarette smoke, cheap hair products, and leather. And then she analyzed the predator himself. She was listening to his voice, noted his accent, his speech cadence, how fast he was breathing, and the specific vocabulary he used whenever he barked orders at her. She even reached out in the darkness and used her fingers to feel the texture of the dashboard, the seat covers, the contours of the door handle. She didn't stop at those mental notes. She actively sought ways to leave physical evidence behind, forensic breadcrumbs that hopefully investigators would find later. While being held down on the car floor, she deliberately pressed her fingers into every surface, ensuring her fingers were deposited on the interior glass, the plastic trim, somewhere that perhaps he wouldn't think to wipe down. When they finally arrived at his apartment, he led her inside, still blindfolded, and she kept that mental recorder spinning. She counted the number of steps it took to get to the front door. She felt the texture of the carpet under her bare feet. She smelled the air inside of the apartment, picking up on household cleaners and dog fur. Every piece of information was an anchor holding Lisa to reality. She was refusing to be just a victim. She was systematically transforming herself into the ultimate forensic evidence collector. Bobby Joe Long thought he had brought home another target who he could simply dominate and discard after he destroyed her. He had no idea what was going on in this girl's room and that she was building a blueprint that law enforcement would use to tear his entire world apart. When Bobby Joe Long brought Lisa into the apartment on North Rome Avenue, he stripped off her clothes, bound her hands, and kept the thick blindfold tied tightly around her eyes. In total darkness, stripped completely of any physical control, Lisa was facing a predator who had already murdered 8 women in 8 months. Long was an offender who sought to completely dominate his victims. He wanted them terrified, silent, powerless. He wanted tears, pleas for mercy, panic, and eventual shutdown. But Lisa realized something critical almost immediately. She knew if she played the role of passive victim, she wouldn't make it through the night. So sitting in that room, she made a choice. She knew she couldn't overpower him. She knew she couldn't run. And even if she could run, where was she going to go? Naked in the middle of the night. She didn't even see where they were. She couldn't even see where she was. So she focused on what she could do in this moment. She could talk to him. She could listen. She could pay attention to his moods and figure out the things that made him calmer, what made him angry, and what might make him see her as a person. The first objective was probably the hardest. Stop being an object in Long's mind. See, serial predators like Bobby Joe Long rely on objectification. To them, a victim isn't a person with a life or a family or feelings. A victim is an object to be used and thrown away. As long as Lisa remained anonymous to him, she was an object and killing her would be easy. So Lisa started talking. She didn't scream, no yelling. Instead, she asked calm questions, engaged him in conversation. When he yelled orders at her, she answered him directly and softly. She talked about the mundane, her life, her job at the donut shop, and her family. Every sentence was just meant to make him see her as a living, breathing human being. The next step was building rapport. This wasn't a Stockholm Syndrome situation. Lisa did not like him, and she had no desire to actually sympathize with him. But she understood that it's really hard to kill somebody if you feel connected to them. So she listened to how he spoke. She paid attention to his tone, his vocabulary, and the speed of his speech, and she subtly began to mirror it. If he was calm, Lisa was calm. If he was upset or frustrated, she validated his feelings. She got him to start talking about himself. He told her his name was Bobby, his job. He told her how long he had been living alone. Every time he spoke to Lisa, she positioned herself not as an enemy or an opponent, but as someone who was listening to him, someone who understood him, someone he didn't need to destroy to feel in control. And then came probably the hardest part. She had to find a way to regulate her own fear. When your life is in danger, your nervous system floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol. Your heart races, your pulse quickens, your breath gets shallow, and your brain starts preparing to run or fight. But panic actually destroys higher level critical thinking. At the time, Lisa didn't know the psychology behind it, but she knew that she couldn't panic. So in the dark, she focused on her breathing. Inhale, exhale, steady, slow, deliberate breaths to keep her heart rate down and keep her mind sharp. She refused to shut down. Even while he was assaulting her, she didn't shut down. Lisa knew that men like Bobby often feel invincible until they realize that the outside world might learn of what happened. And so she started planting seeds. Little things about what might happen if she disappeared. She mentioned her family. She mentioned the late shifts and her boss at the Krispy Kreme and how they were probably already surprised that she hadn't come into work this morning. She casually brought up that people knew where she often rode her bike and they knew when her shift ended. She never threatened him. Definitely never said, the police are going to catch you. That would have backed him into a corner and triggered violence. Lisa slowly shifted the narrative, planting the idea that keeping her or killing her carried a lot of risk. People might already be looking for her. Releasing her was the safest option for him. And even while managing her fear and engaging him, Lisa kept paying attention. She felt the layout of the bathroom whenever he let her in to clean up, memorizing the exact location of the sink, the toilet, and the towel rack. She noticed the smell of his soap in the bathroom. She felt the unique texture of his carpet and upholstery. She kept track of the passage of time by listening to street traffic and ambient noises as she could hear people waking up in the morning, people coming back home. She felt his face with her hands whenever the opportunity allowed. She memorized how his jaw felt, his hair, the size of his overall frame. Bobby Joe Long spent 26 hours believing he had orchestrated a flawless crime. He had no idea Lisa McVey had turned his apartment into a crime scene that he really would never be able to fully scrub clean. After those 26 hours of unimaginable trauma and psychological chess, something happened that had never happened in the 8 months prior. Bobby didn't take her to a remote field. He didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he drove her to a secluded oak tree near an empty parking lot, dropped her off blindfolded, and he drove away. No one can say with absolute certainty why she survived when so many others did not, but investigators, criminal profiles, and even Lisa herself have pointed to one undeniable truth. Her survival was not an accident. It was the direct result of an extraordinary way that she engaged him, managed his ego, and remained mentally present in a room built to break her. Standing under that oak tree, Lisa removed her blindfold and watched the taillights of the Dodge Magnum disappear. She was alive. Most people in that moment would have collapsed from the exhaustion and shock, but Lisa knew her job wasn't finished. The map in her head was fresh. The details were still there, but she knew the clock was ticking. People forget things easily. So she immediately went to the police. And when she sat down with investigators, she didn't just tell them she was kidnapped. She started talking. She went through everything, the route, turn by turn. She gave him the details of the car interior, the details of his apartment. She told him about the soap, the texture of the carpet, the sounds from his neighborhood, the physical description of the man who had raped her. And then she told them about the microscopic red carpet fibers she had intentionally left her own marks on. That should have set off alarm bells to those officers. And you would expect, after surviving 26 hours with a serial killer, escaping, walking into a police station, the hard part's over, right? They should give you a blanket and hand you a glass of water and listen with urgency while they take notes. Instead, Lisa McVey walked into a cold, crushing reality that's still true today. Nobody believed her. When she first told her story to the police and then her family when they arrived, she was met with skepticism, eye rolls, outright disbelief. To them, this account sounded like a melodrama, an elaborate lie cooked up by a teenager to cover up the fact that she had stayed out past curfew. I mean, Lisa had run away in the past, and she was known to have come from a chaotic and very broken home. To all of the adults around her, it was way easier to label Lisa as just a problem child who was seeking attention than to entertain the possibility that not only was what they suspected to be true, a serial killer was roaming the streets of Tampa, but she had met him. Her story made it all very real. For a girl who spent her entire childhood enduring secret abuse, being called a liar when you finally reach out for help was a familiar and devastating gut punch. She had fought for 26 hours to stay alive, holding on to every detail like a lifeline, only to be told she was making it all up. And while the initial officers dismissed her, one man in Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office heard the story and decided he wanted to listen to Lisa. His name, Detective Larry Pinkerton. He didn't look at Lisa through the lens of her terrible family background or her family's dysfunction. He was a seasoned investigator who knew what trauma looked like, and more importantly, he knew what a killer's trail looked like. So when Pinkerton sat down across from Lisa, he did something no other officer had done yet. He actually listened. And as he listened, he realized almost immediately, this girl is not lying. A teenager that makes up a fake kidnapping story gives vague details. They talk about a scary guy in a dark mask or a black van. Lisa gave him details that no one could pull out of thin air. She described the exact cadence of this man's voice, his vocabulary, his personal habits. She knew the layout of his home, down to the position of the towel rack and the distinct scent of the soap in the bathroom. She described a unique, coarse texture of a red carpet on the floorboards of the vehicle. She gave him exact turn-by-turn timing, traffic sounds, environmental landmarks that she could hear while blindfolded. Pinkerton recognized genuine, raw trauma responses as Lisa spoke to him. But more than that, he recognized she had an incredibly disciplined mind. He realized he wasn't looking at a teenager who was making up a story. He was looking at the only known living victim of the Tampa Bay serial killer. And she had somehow talked herself out of a grave. Larry Pinkerton looked at Lisa and said the words that she desperately needed to hear for the past 4 years of her life. I believe you. And that moment changed everything. Pinkerton didn't just believe her, he started to act. Immediately, he contacted the multi-agency task force that had been investigating the string of unsolved women's murders in the area. And he said, stop looking for a ghost, guys. I have a witness sitting right here in my office. She has been in this man's car inside his home, and she has felt his face with her own hands. Because that one detective chose to listen, Lisa's mental blueprint was handed over to the state's top investigators. And within days, that red carpet fiber she described led the police straight to Bobby Joe Long's Dodge Magnum. For 8 long months, the Joint Task Force had been staring at a wall of dead ends. They were honestly starting to feel disheartened. They had bodies dumped across rural counties, no crime scenes, no suspects, no solid leads. Lisa changed everything in a single afternoon. They sent over a sketch artist and investigators, methodically unpacking the mental map she had spent those 26 hours going over and over in her head. She gave them the physical profile first. A white male, roughly 5'8", slender build, light brown hair, distinct speech patterns. Then came the vehicle. She described the interior of his car with uncanny accuracy, the feel of the bucket seats, the shape of the dashboard, and crucial, the shade and coarse loop texture of the red carpet fibers that had been on her own body when he let her out of the car. Investigators immediately realized that it matched. Those microscopic red nylon fibers were on other murder victims' bodies. This was the exact physical and tactile match they had been searching for. Next, Lisa walked detectives through the blindfold ride. She started talking about how long it took him to make certain turns, the speed changes, the transition from that smooth pavement to the rough gravel, and the overhead aircraft. And by cross-referencing her mental timeline with the local road maps and the flight paths from nearby airports, they were able to determine that Lisa had been taken to a neighborhood in North Tampa, specifically surrounding the North Rome area. This stopped the police from this blind hunt around all of Tampa Bay and allowed them to focus their lens with precision. They started an undercover surveillance team, and it flooded the target grid, looking specifically for a late model red car with matching red interior. And on November 16th, 1984, 13 days after Lisa's escape, they spotted a red 1978 Dodge Magnum outside of a local movie theater. And a quick registration check linked the vehicle to 31-year-old X-ray tech, Bobby Joe Long. And when you know it, he lived on North Rome Avenue. The investigators moved in quietly. When they looked through the window of the Dodge Magnum, there it was, that distinct red carpet. Police placed Bobby Joe Long under arrest as soon as he walked out to his car. And when detectives searched his apartment, every detail that Lisa had cataloged was right there waiting for them. The bathroom, the soap, the carpet, and they also found items from each of his victims. He had taken trophies. During Bobby Joe Long's interrogation, they showed him all of the forensic evidence and the undeniable witness testimony of the girl he had let go. His confidence completely disintegrated. And the tragedy of this situation is, had those original officers listened to Lisa, they might have been able to save Virginia Lee Johnson and Kimberly Swan. Virginia was killed on November 6th and Kimberly on the 12th, just one day before his arrest. When the cuffs clicked around Bobby Joe Long's wrists, the headlines declared a victory. A serial killer was off the streets. The task force was celebrated. The public breathed a collective sigh of relief. But for Lisa McVey, the end of the police investigation was the beginning of a brand new, terrible battle. Media stories often stop at the arrest, treating it like the final scene of the movie, where the hero walks away and the screen fades to black. But real life doesn't work that way. Trauma doesn't neatly dissolve just because the predator is put behind bars. Lisa was still only 17 years old, and she still carried deep, unhealed wounds of a childhood spent surviving an abusive home. Now, compounded with the profound horror of 26 hours of captivity and assault, she was suffering from severe PTSD, recurring nightmares, and the overwhelming weight of carrying a story that no one her age could possibly understand. There was no one she could share this with. Her friends didn't get it. Even her boss couldn't understand. Surviving the night was one thing. Learning how to live through the days that followed was a new and difficult fight. In psychology, there is something known as post-traumatic growth. It is the idea that individuals who endure profound trauma can not only recover, but transform their suffering into purpose, strength, and deep personal resilience. Lisa McVey didn't just rebuild her life, she reclaimed it, piece by piece, refusing to let the worst moments of her past dictate her future. And she made choices that honored that resilience. First, she built a family. She chose love, connection, and stability. And eventually, becoming a mother, creating a safe, nurturing home for her own children, the kind of home that she had been denied growing up. And then she realized that she had a unique ability to observe, stay calm under pressure, and understand criminal minds. She realized that this was a calling, and so she pursued a life of service. In 1994, 10 years after she was abducted, Lisa joined the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, the very same agency that had helped bring down her captor. She spent the next 30 years serving as a law enforcement officer, a specialized deputy, and a school resource officer. But she didn't just wear a badge. She brought a level of empathy and insight to the job that few officers could match. She dedicated most of her career to investigating crimes against children, protecting young people, and speaking to child victims who were trapped in the same dark, silent rooms of domestic abuse that Lisa had once inhabited. When a terrified child sat across from Officer Lisa Nolan, they weren't talking to an authority figure who didn't understand them. They were talking to somebody that had been there, who knew what it felt like to be unheard, who had proven that escape was possible. And she became a voice for the voiceless, using her career to ensure that no child's pain was dismissed or ignored the ways that hers had initially been. Over the years, Lisa also took her story to national and international platforms. She became a public speaker, an advocate, an educator. She traveled all over America to address law enforcement agencies, victim advocacy groups, and survival networks. She taught police officers how to properly interview traumatized victims. She reminded them to stop looking at their past backgrounds and behavioral red flags and look for the truth underneath. She taught survivors how to harness their inner strength and reframe their trauma, not as a mark of shame, but as proof of their strength. And in 2018, her story was brought to millions more people by the film Believe Me, The Abduction of Lisa McVey, bringing this extraordinary tactical survival mindset into the global spotlight. And then on May 23rd, 2019, in Rayford, Florida, Lisa sat in the front row of Bobby Joe Long's execution, closing a chapter on an evil that had entered her life 35 years earlier. She told the media, "If he opened his eyes, I wanted him to see me first." Unfortunately, Bobby Joe Long did not open his eyes. I think he knew that Lisa was there, and he would have to look her straight in the eye and know that not only had he lost, but that she had bested him every step of the way. Lisa McVey's story isn't inspiring simply because she survived a serial killer. It's inspiring because she refused to let violence define her life. She took a childhood stolen by abuse, a night of terror on a dark street, and she forged it into a life protecting other people, serving her community, and proving that light can overcome the deepest darkness. Bobby Joe Long might be the reason we know about Lisa McVey, but he is not the reason we remember her. As we bring this first story of the season to a close, I keep coming back to something Lisa said about that night. Hours before Bobby Joe Long found her, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep living. And when someone tried to take that choice away from her, she fought like hell to keep it. Not through overpowering him, not some dramatic escape. She survived by paying attention, listening, talking, making herself a person to someone who had decided not to see her as one. She remembered everything she could, left behind whatever evidence she could, and held on to the belief that if she could just make it home, she could tell someone what happened, and she did. That's what I want this season of When Killers Get Caught to be about. I've spent years telling stories about the people who caused unimaginable harm. We know their names. We study their childhoods, discuss their motives, dissect their lives. We make documentaries about them and give them nicknames they'll be remembered for long after they're dead. But there is another side to all of these stories. The people who lived. Survival doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes it's fighting, sometimes it's running, sometimes it's hiding, sometimes it's standing very still and waiting for the right moment. Sometimes it's talking to the person you're terrified of, because you need them to understand you're a real person. And sometimes it is simply deciding, I'm going to see tomorrow. Lisa McVey saw tomorrow, and then she saw another one and another one. She helped investigators identify the man who had taken her. She became a law enforcement officer herself. She built a life, found purpose in what she survived, eventually sat in that front row when the man who held her life in his hands reached the own end of his life. But that's the thing. Bobby Joe Long only got 26 hours. Lisa got the next 40 years. And counting. We remember Lisa Nolan because at 17 years old, on one of the worst nights imaginable, she decided her story wasn't going to end there. Thank you for listening to When Killers Get Caught. If Lisa's story stayed with you, subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you happen to be listening. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. And as we move through this season, we're going to meet more people like Lisa. Not because of the worst things that someone did to them, but because of everything they did afterward. Until next week, stay safe, look out for one another, and remember, the truth always leaves a trail. I'm Brittany Ransom. Thank you for listening.